Welcome, friends, to our NCDEO session of Workshop Wednesdays on culturally responsive pedagogy. I'm Marissa Nesbitt. I'm the Vice President of Professional Development of the North Carolina Dance Education Organization, and I am here with my colleague, Ashley Cartledge, our NCDEO President-elect, and Ashley will be taking us through our session tonight. Following our session, anyone who was registered will receive a link to the Zoom recording and to the materials that Ashley has shared. That will come out next Monday from our VP of Communications, Ashley Tate. Without further ado, I'll pass it on to my colleague, Ashley Cartledge.
Hey, hello. Thank you, Marissa, for that wonderful introduction. Hello to those of you all who are joining us live, as well as those who might be watching the recording later. So I am actually going to share my screen so that we can begin. Always fun with the awkward pause in the midst of sharing the screen. And here we go. Fabulous. All right, so this is the workshop on culturally responsive teaching and pedagogy. And so I'm going to talk about changing your classroom culture through culturally responsive teaching and pedagogical methods. Right. So thank you, Marissa, who introduced us earlier. She is also our moderator, and that's just a little info there. Okay. So I'm actually going to begin with an acknowledgement first. And so I am currently located in a room with a white wall. I am a Black and Indian female, and I have red and orange hair. I am sitting in front of a painting that contains a tiger. I love cats, so that is going on in the background. I am wearing a gray shirt with the NCDEO logo proudly representing, and a teal cardigan over it. I also want to begin with a land acknowledgement. So I come to you from the land of Greenville, North Carolina, which is the native land of the Lumbee as well as the Tuscarora tribe. If you're interested in finding out the native land that you possess, there'll be a link available for you in the chat. You can go to nativeland.ca and see where it is that you hung from. And I also want to acknowledge our individual journeys and what brings us here and everything that has happened in our life to get us to this moment. So just take a breath and we'll begin. Thank you. Right. So we're actually going to start with a little bit of an interactive piece. If you would like to scan the QR code, you are welcome to, or you can go to menti.com, either using your phone or whatever is the most comfortable for you. And then there is a code where you can interact. So the code is 84257831. And so I'll give you a moment to interact and to scan, and then I'll switch to the view of the Menti where you can actually see what is happening. But the question that it's asking on the Mentimeter are what words, ideas, or thoughts come to mind when you hear the term culturally responsive pedagogy. So I'll give you a moment to do that. And then I will switch screens. And the information will also be in the Menti as well. Sorry, I have to move my little black bar over. There we go. So we're starting to see some responses. I see diversity. Yes, excellent. And it could be words, phrases, any sort of visual images that you have that sort of help you hone in on that idea of what culturally responsive pedagogy is. Right. And then this is actually still active for a few more days. So if you happen to be joining us and watching on the recording, I'd love to put together a big word cloud of sort of our initial thoughts about culturally responsive pedagogy and what comes to mind when we think about those things. So thank you so much for your contribution. So diversity is definitely a portion of it. But it's only a small portion of it. And so today we're going to hone in on some key ideas and terms. Before we sort of fully dive into the session, I do want to recognize the work of our IDEA committee. They just held a session on Monday on the Parent Bill of Rights. And so they are working to make sure that dance educators are informed in the field. And so they were actually established in 2021 as one of the first subcommittees that NCDEO has to offer. And they're basically working to promote diversity, which is the word that was highlighted in the Mentimeter. Thank you so much, as well as inclusion in our field. And so just so everyone's on the same page in terms of the definitions, these are the definitions that have been put out by our IDEA committee in terms of what qualifies as diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I'll give you a moment to sort of glance over these definitions before we move along. We are very grateful to the work that Audrey, Baran, and Jasmine Powell are doing with the IDEA committee currently. So thank you for these key terms as well as definitions. All right, so here's the big question that a lot of people are wondering and thinking about of what culturally responsive teaching is, what it looks like, and how it can be applied in their own backgrounds. So in terms of some overarching principles of culturally responsive teaching, it is student-centered as well as democratic. It promotes individual growth for your students that are part of your classroom, and that includes growth actively, cooperatively, as well as social processes that we want to see our students engage in. It relates personal growth to public life. So we're working on real world applications. It also helps to instill and build an inquiry with concepts such as inequality, justice, power, as well as society. And one idea is that it's a negotiated learning process. So this is not an authoritarian teaching method where it's kind of like what I say and you follow. It's very much meant to be a collaborative and inclusive environment for yourself and for your students. And so we have this sort of student-centered mutual teacher-student authority being built as part of the classroom. So one thing, or rather many things, that you want to think about as you're trying to cultivate and to foster a culturally responsive environment. So these are some tips to help get you started within your own work. One is just honestly really knowing and understanding who you are. Recognizing your cultural identities and biases. And so it's not just about race. It's about sort of everything that makes up who you are. And then also understanding the same things of your students. So knowing what their backgrounds are, knowing your demographics, as well as any biases that they may bring into the classroom, any preferences that they may bring into the classroom. We're trying to build collective responsibility through a positive environment. We are incorporating economic, political, and social context into the classrooms. And then we're also using classroom management strategies that are responsive and relevant to the environment in which you teach. So I kind of highlighted on this earlier. So just remembering that when we're talking about cultural identity and forms, that it's not just about race. And so it involves many things: your religions, your beliefs, your preferences, your creeds, anything that accounts to all of your life's moments and sort of what got you to where you are. Okay. Oh, I'm so sorry. Pardon me. Okay. And then also understanding those of your students. So these are just kind of reminders and highlights of what I mentioned previously. And so there's this great quote that I heard from Crystal U. Davis when I attended one of her conference sessions in 2022 at the NCDEO conference. And I think this is really important to highlight. So this is not necessarily saying that biases are bad. We all have biases, and that's sort of what makes us human. But the idea and the issue of when they can become damaging is when we're unaware of what they are and how they can begin to affect others, especially with us being teachers in the context of the classroom. In terms of making sure that you're understanding your students' cultural backgrounds as well as biases that they may have, you want to think about creating curriculum that is going to be relevant to the students and relevant to the populations in which you teach. And so obviously we have things where we are expected from the standards to teach and highlight certain things within our curriculum. If you happen to be K-12, or if you are working in a private environment where they sort of have a pre-outlined curriculum, but you can still find ways to make what you have to teach and what is required to teach engaging and relevant for the students and putting it into context that they can understand and relate to. So it's also about fostering and cultivating an environment of not only positivity, but also collective responsibility. So we want the students to collaborate. We want them to gain a sense of ownership in their work, in the room, in the environment. And so the students are actually more likely to succeed if they feel comfortable and if they feel connected to an environment that is positive, an environment that is respectful, and that there's a good relationship that is built with the teacher and with the students that are involved. You also want to think about as a teacher when you're looking at the curriculum as a whole of how current policies, either set out by your state or nationally, depending on what context it is that you're teaching, or by your university, in discipline as well, can discriminate against certain students. So depending on sort of what your role may be in the educative process, maybe you're not necessarily in a position of authority where you can make those changes, but you can control what happens in your room and thinking carefully about discipline in your room. So one example that I always highlight is sometimes listening to what my students' intentions are and not necessarily what they say. Because sometimes they can come off like a little rough or sound attitudey, and there may be some who view it as disrespectful, but maybe in their own home environments, that's actually just how they talk. And so part of that comes from knowing your students and understanding, what their environments are before you can determine whether something is necessarily disrespectful or not. So just kind of think carefully about the context of your students when it comes to disciplinary action as well. Right. And then our last bullet point in terms of beginning to foster an environment that is culturally responsive is how you manage your classroom. So making sure that you're doing so through a lens of diversity, and again, considering the population of not even just who you teach in the school, but like who's reflected in your classroom at that moment. If you happen to teach class to class or in a series of periods, then the students that you get in one class are very different than the students that you get in another class. And so I may have the same entry level foundations class for 2 periods, but they are completely different sets of students. And so knowing how to manage and to negotiate that environment comes from really getting to know my students and the context in which they develop and think and grow. Right, so I did a lot of talking just then. So we're actually going to take a moment to examine a resource. I'm going to put a link to it in the chat as well. And I want you to take a moment of looking at this distinctions of equity charts glancing over what is involved, and then you can either put into the chat or I would really love for us to have a discussion of sort of thinking about where it is you feel like you lean in your personal teaching practice now that you have a wee bit of background information. And so I'm going to pause sharing my screen at this time so that I can put the link in the chat for you all to access that, as I know you do not have the link. All right, so that is the link to the document. So please take a moment to look at the document and look over it. And then I want you to reflect on your own teaching environment and kind of see where it is you feel like you fit within the context of those three categories. So we have multicultural education, social justice education, and culturally responsive education. So I'll give you a moment to look at that. And then when you're ready, feel free to unmute and share a little bit about where you feel like you're landing and why.
Do you want me to jump in now, Ashley, on this?
Absolutely, yes, take it away. Thank you.
So, this is an interesting, because I'm not familiar with Hammond. I know that Banks, like sort of in his model, situates multicultural, what he calls multicultural social justice education as like the top, because that's the one that focused on action. And this chart seems like it's about awareness, but not necessarily action in the social justice piece. I feel like my work kind of lives more in the culturally responsive side, more in the sense of thinking about the ways of being that we are in a classroom that my students might bring, and how I can teach in ways that support those and bring those out. One of the things that I run into is like a lot of the social justice education, when we get into political context, of course, all education is power, and all teaching and learning is inherently political, because we're always communicating something about the nature of who has power, and who has agency and authority to speak, right? That's the bread and butter of what we teach, but it's often hidden. But when we explicitly raise those issues up and talk about them, we have to be careful in North Carolina as public employees, right? And then also, I don't teach a social studies class. I don't even teach a history class right now. I teach a pedagogy class and a creative process class, right? So how much of the social and political can I bring in while still maintaining my focus on the content that I'm supposed to be teaching in any given course? So I feel like that's where culturally responsive education gives me a lot more space, because I can be malleable and creative in how I focus, like this chart says, on the affective and cognitive aspects of teaching, without walking that line of where my political beliefs and ideas about power coming in ways that might be perceived as not aligned with the content. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and you actually brought up a really good point. And I know this is going to sound like a plug for CAN for a second, but I am part of the Connected Arts Networks, which is a part of a larger arts network of all the national organizations. So the theater organization, visual arts organization and the music organization. So all of the national organizations for the arts have PLCs where we're basically working and learning and really diving into this work. One thing that I really appreciate as being a part of a program is there are fellow Southern educators within the program. And so we are in environments where we are working to strategize and negotiate sort of how do we still incorporate the work that is important without stepping on toes, because I feel like as educators, we know and understand that these ideals in a greater, broader sense are important. But, how can we communicate that to leadership that doesn't necessarily see the importance of that work? And so one thing I really appreciate from CAN, and then it's also in the resources that will go out at the end when you receive it on Monday, I believe, there is sort of an alternative words chart that provides the words that we know are important, like diversity, equity, inclusion, which unfortunately even social emotional learning in some aspects are kind of like political, oh no, what's happening? And so I really appreciate one of the presenters that took the time to break things down in real world applications and actually put it in more of a business context of like, these are the skills that we want people to be successful and get a job and function in society. And so we know that the words, the magical buzzwords that are very important, but don't necessarily land in a pleasing note to those who are in charge. I think that's really important. So I do appreciate the work that CAN is doing to help educate and to help inform and to help instill power for us as educators to still be able to do the work that we feel is important, but navigate our situations in a way that is special. So side note, those CAN applications do close November 13th. So there's still time to apply. That'll also be in the resources. I won't take up the whole time talking about that, but I could. And so as we're looking at the distinctions of equity chart, one thing that I want to mention before I give our lovely other participant an opportunity to hopefully voice their opinion is when looking at this chart, it's not a continuum. And so it's not meant to be like multicultural education is, the start, and then you move on to social justice education, and then you move on to culturally responsive education. These are basically different lenses that we can apply. So they're all important and they're all valuable. But sometimes, we may lean more, depending on our environment, as you brought up the issue of environment, towards one thing because we know that that is safe. But like all of these things are things that are important. So we want to have social harmony within our classroom. We want to sort of develop that critical consciousness and that idea of inquiry and curiosity within our students. And then we also want them to be able to learn independently. And so even though there are political lenses within each of those things, those are kind of still the overarching goals of like, this is what we want our students to be able to do. So how are you feeling? I'm not sure if it's Ina or Anna, apologies if I butchered that. Where do you feel like you're landing in your environment or your context? And there's no wrong answer. It's just sort of, where you feel like you are or tend to lean. Or if you're not comfortable voicing it, feel free to put it in the chat.
I'm sorry, I'm driving. I'm not.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
At it right now.
Okay, please be
I'll
safe.
definitely pull it up soon.
Okay. Yeah, totally, no problem. So let me give you a little more context since you are driving. So the distinctions of equity chart from Hammond's work sort of lays out 3 key points. So we have multicultural education, which is sort of focusing more on diversity. So it's including like diverse in our context. So it would be things like diverse dance styles and, showing videos of those different styles. exposing students to cultures that not only reflect their own, but are also indicative of who's outside of the room, who's not in the room. And then it does a little bit of like shallow end pool work in terms of multiple perspectives and getting students to realize their privilege in their particular context. But it's very, it's more so focusing on like diversity of what you're bringing into your classroom. Then there is social justice education, where we're starting to plant those seeds of curiosity. And so we're looking at political contexts within the subject area. So for us as dancers, it could be something as simple as, you know, covering, I'm just throwing an example out there. I will admit my own bias. I am a modern dance baby, born and raised. So within modern dance, when they were sort of rebelling against ballet, and they were also making and creating work that was relating to the political context of that time. So something like that could be a starting point for looking at social justice education. But then it's also you as the educator taking time to start making those systemic changes within your classroom environment. And so we're not yet outside of the realm of what is happening. And so we're also trying to create a lens for our students and sort of recognizing, bringing awareness, and hopefully planting the seeds of interrupting the issues that are at hand in our greater society. And then lastly, there's culturally responsive education, which is sort of the focus of what we're doing, where this is more so focusing on the students themselves. And so we're looking at diversifying in the sense of differentiation with our students, not only incorporating diverse contexts in terms of the dance styles and the things that we do, but also making sure that student choice, student voice, student agency is represented and a part of the environment. We're also working with building their abilities cognitively, as well as academically in terms of their mindsets when it comes to pushing back on what is typically represented in the classroom. And so I know that's probably a lot to think about as you're driving. I appreciate you joining us while you were driving. And so that is the chart that we're currently looking at. So from those descriptions, if you can recall, do you feel like there's one that you lean more towards? And it's okay if you can't unmute at this moment, but you can take a moment to reflect.
I would say that as a student, I feel like I've experienced the first one the most.
Okay, multicultural education, yes.
Yes, I think that's probably been the most accessible for the teachers that I've experienced. Unfortunately, in most settings, and even more so as you get into higher level education in dance, the multiculturalism of the staff is not necessarily particularly diverse. So I've seen people, you know, do a special class or bring someone in and pay someone that does that work to teach. And I've liked that experience. As a teacher, the style that I think I've mostly taught probably has more to do with social justice, just in the nature of the style of dance, mostly social dance at this point. Yeah. I don't really
I'm sorry, continue.
Sorry, I don't really feel that I've had I don't teach in like the public sector or the education, like public education sector anymore. So I don't I don't really feel that my experiences in academia have supported any of those teaching styles, other than, again, like some access to the first.
Got you. And so what is your environment? I know you said you were a student. Are you currently teaching?
I'm not currently. I have, I mean, I've been dancing for a long time, and I've taken a lot of university coursework in dance, and I've taught privately, both in studios and just to the public. But I had sort of stepped away from studio dance and into the social dance world for several years, and I'm just sort of dipping my toes back in to more individual styles of dance. And I saw that you went to UNCG, so I was interested in that program.
Oh, yay, thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
Go Spartans. Yeah, so you actually brought up something that is very important. And while we in our positions currently, because I know we are all in education or in the teaching practice, or you as a student currently, so we're not able to necessarily make the change, but you did bring up a very important fact of the faculty or the staff rep also being a representative of the student body itself. And so that is definitely a goal, and that is definitely something that is important, because we do want to see eventually, people mirroring the environments in which they're in. Or even if you don't happen to mirror the environment of which you're in, like making sure that you're bringing that into the context of what you teach. So there is still work that can be done, even if you're not at a level where you can make that change. And so one thing that I really appreciate from a workshop, I think it was Goldie Muhammad, a workshop that I attended with them, was they talked about how, although it is big change that needs to happen, like there are still small things that we as individual teachers can do. And I found that very comforting, because sometimes I get kind of stuck in this world of like, I want to change all these things and do all this stuff, but I'm just me, and so remembering that, big change happens in very, very small, tiny doses, and that you, at minimum, you can control the environment in which you teach and foster your students. And so don't lose sight of that. Don't get discouraged. For those of you who may be looking at the recording, if you think about this work and it feels very overwhelming, it is, but there are also very small, tiny things that you can do on your end to begin this process or to continue this process. Because I can promise you, as I can tell you, you're doing way more than you think you do. And that is just true of education in general. Like, we do so much, we don't always have time to think about and reflect on all the things that we're doing, but we're doing things and they're important. So I think that is a great transition into our next piece. And so I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. But thank you so much for contributing your thoughts and your reflections in terms of the distinctions of equity chart. And so again, with the distinctions of equity chart, remember, it's not a continuum. This is not about starting in one place and ending up in one place. These are just reminders of things and moments that we as educators can do through the whole of our curriculum. So there is no right or wrong. It's just, this is what I'm doing in this moment. And that's why I really appreciate this chart, because it doesn't make you feel like you're less than if you're in a certain spot. It's just, these are the things. So thank you, Hammond. All right, so I do want to give a little bit of background. I am a little bit of a demographic nerd, so you'll just have to bear with me. Because before I talk to you all about things that I specifically do in my classroom, I do think it is important to talk about the context in which my classroom is built, so that you're understanding that the things that I'm talking about, I have curated to fit within my particular context. And so it doesn't mean that you're not able to take some of these things and alter it, but just be aware when you're creating your own things as well, that you want to think about the population in which you serve. And so making changes to some of the things that I suggest to serve your population, by all means, do that. And so I teach at a high school. It is a rural high school in Bethel, North Carolina. We have about 808 students. Our population is a mostly societally minority population. And so our highest level of population are Black and African American students. And then our next highest population is Hispanics, then white students. We have a few multiracial students, and we don't really have a lot of representation of Asian Americans or those who are part of the Native community. And one thing that I really like to point out is my high school, which is one of 9 high schools in the county, our demographics are the complete inverse of the county in which I teach. And so the county that I teach in, which is Pitt County, basically just flip everything I said upside down, and that's the county. And so the majority of the county itself is white and Caucasian, followed by the African American population, then the Latino population. Then we also have multiracial, a tiny bit of Asian representation, and an even smaller bit of Native representation. And so I say this to illustrate the point of my school and my students and who is represented in the room. And so because we are the complete inverse of our county, there are lots of factors that come into play for my students before they even walk into the room. Some of them, before they even get to the classroom for first period, have already ridden the bus for anywhere from, 15 minutes to as far as an hour and a half, depending on where they live. And so our area where our school is really rural. And so the pull for the attendance area is really large. And so we actually have the widest attendance area range. So even something as small as they had to ride a bus for an hour and a half, and now all of a sudden they have to dance in his first period. Things like that you want to be aware of, and sort of understanding the context of your environment as you're beginning to make plans. Within my dance class, one thing that I'm really excited about is a fairly good representation of the school itself. And so it reflects the same population where it's majority African American, followed by Hispanic and Latina and X populations, multiracial. And so it's a really good range of the environment in which I teach in my dance classes. A lot of my dance students do not have formal training. Just to specify what I mean, I just mean that they have not taken class in a studio or been part of a community dance program, like taking classes at Boys and Girls Club or anything like that. So a lot of them are starting from like square one when I begin. And so I say all of this to say, these are some things that I found have been really helpful that you can apply into your context as you're beginning to try to foster what culturally responsive pedagogy can look like in your room. And so when I'm creating my classroom environment and my classroom structure, it's really important to start by seeing your students. And so you want to make sure that there are representations. You want your students to feel seen. And so having representations visually of dancers, not only from different genres of dance, but also different cultures doing those different genres, making sure that we're taking the time to incorporate multicultural resources and materials within your content. So that kind of pulls back to that multicultural education piece. And then making sure that there are also opportunities where their heritages and their life experiences are brought to the table and acknowledged. And so I actually do a survey with my students not right at the beginning of the year, because I like to kind of foster a little bit of trust before I start asking them, like, who are you? Where'd you come from? All of those things. But I do have my students do a survey where they can self-identify different aspects of their heritage, of their dance background and experiences. I'd be happy to send that survey. And then I also start by asking them, like, what is a dance style that sticks out to you? So like, what's something that you think is good dance? And so from having them submit those videos, it kind of gives me a glimpse early in the semester of like, okay, what do my students value? what do they see as quote unquote good or cool, and sort of taking a moment to compare it to my personal preferences and finding ways to incorporate their preferences into the curriculum and into the styles in which I teach. The next thing is that you want to make sure that your students are valued. And so now that you have that knowledge of, the community in which you teach. So if you're not as familiar with your school community, I highly advise you to sort of look into the demographics of the community in which you teach and the school, and sort of compare your class to the community as a whole and where all that is standing. But you also want your students to feel valued. And for that to happen, you have to know what their experiences are. And I'm not saying get all up in your students' business, because that would be a little awkward. We want to set appropriate, healthy boundaries for us as students and educators. But we do want to find out what they're interested in, find out what their opinions are. And that's something very small you can do to show them that you care. You also still want to hold them to those high expectations. So even though a lot of my students come into my classroom without a dance background or knowledge in a formal sense, because we all have experiences with movement, and we as dance educators know that that counts. But I still want to make sure, like, if I'm talking about technique and we're supposed to be embodying a certain technique as it relates to a certain style, I'm going to drill into them like, hey, you've got to point that toe. Hey, you've got to flex that foot. Hey, we're supposed to be in bent knees. Like, whatever the style is, making sure that we're truly embodying that and holding them to the expectations of make sure you're doing X. And so holding them to those high expectations, even though sometimes they get frustrated with you, is also a way to say that you care. Because if you just let it slide and let it go by, like, oh, my kids don't have any formal training, so it's just going to look like whatever, and you just let it slide by, you're not really investing in them and trying to make the best out of them, So then once they are seen and valued in their classrooms, then you want to give them a chance to be heard. So give them a chance to voice their ideas and opinions. I try to give as many opportunities to my students of them to provide choice. Hey, do we want a fast or slow warm up today? How are we feeling today? Do we need some deep stretches before we begin? So finding ways within whatever I've planned for the day to still make sure that they have an opportunity to choose something. Choice is important, and them feeling like their opinions are valued is also important. And then making sure that you're diversifying your knowledge and your background and appealing to the different learning styles of your students. So yes, we are kinesthetic people, but sometimes in dance class, we have to figure out other ways to explain things. We've got to use words. My students have really taken to my food analogies for some reason with this one particular class I have. So I try to find, I'm like, okay, how can I talk about food as it relates to this particular dance movement? So I'm talking about like making things smooth, like icing on a cake, or, whatever sort of works for your students, and, making sure that they have an opportunity to voice their opinions and be heard, and finding out how they learn best and making sure that you're incorporating that into the context in which you teach. And then after you have given them an opportunity to be seen in the classroom environment, as well as what you teach, to be valued and sharing those high expectations with them, that you've heard them and you're incorporating their ideas and opinions, then you can actually start to like push them. Okay, now that I see you and I value you and I hear you, I'm going to push you. And it's very difficult to push if you haven't done the above. So you've got to establish that layer of trust, and that comes no matter what environment you're teaching in. That's something that is going to take time to do, but is easy to do. And then I also urge the idea of being authentic. So kids can tell 100% no matter what grade level you teach or what environment you teach in, they know when you're being fake. So still find a way to do these things and remain true to who you are and remain true to your context. Okay. All right, so I've been doing a lot of talking, and you're probably at this point like, okay, this is great information. This is a lot. Where do I begin? Do not lose hope. There are plenty of things that you can do to sort of have a starting point for beginning to make shifts within your classroom. So I really love this quote from Dr. Naima McCarthy Brown's book on dance and diverse pedagogy for dance. I'm probably butchering that title. It's in the resources though. Sorry, Dr. Naima McCarthy Brown. But I think this is a really good thing to sort of just start the reflective process, because a lot of what you need to do to begin to make shifts in your classrooms comes from just reflecting. And so the quote reads, for those of you who are driving, many dance educators feel that dance is open, welcoming to all, and by its creative nature, relevant to all of humanity. I argue that social constructs of race, class, and gender permeate all aspects of society, including dance education, and must be challenged consistently and with all resources possible. And I will 100% admit, when I was first going into my job, of feeling like, oh, dance, it's just inherently open and welcoming, and we all do these things and we're such great people. I'm not saying that we're not great people, but I think it's also important to remember that it depends on who is teaching, what their beliefs are, and even those who taught you may not realize how much influence they've had over you previously. And so if you had probably a negative experience when something was taught to you, there could be a chance that you may be, projecting that onto your students as well. So the first piece is just like awareness. Okay, so everything's not inherently accepting, but you can make it accepting. You can create that environment for your students. And then I cannot take credit for the next one. So Audrey Baran and I did a presentation on something a little similar to what I'm talking about this evening. And this was such a great slide from that presentation. I was like, I gotta put this one back up. So she found this very amazing, powerful quote from Bell Hooks. And we sort of came up with some reflective questions of things you can ponder. Because again, the first step is reflecting. Before you can do, you need to reflect. And so some of the reflection questions I'll read out loud, because I know some of you are in transit. And so thinking about why you teach the things the way that you do and what it is that you're teaching. So as you're teaching, is it because you were taught that way, or is there something more behind it? How do you source the information that you present to your students? Are you using diverse sources as you're sourcing those information for your students? Are you going beyond teaching non-Western dance forms? Even for some of you who may be specialty teachers like jazz, this is what I teach, jazz. Finding connections from other cultures are always representative within a genre. So there are still ways that you can bridge that gap, even within teaching a single dance form. Are you then going beyond and actually teaching these non-Western concert dance forms? And if you are you doing it in the same manner that you would a concert dance form? And so one thing that typically happens in African dance cultures, it's like you pick it up. You see the elders doing it, you pick it up, you do the thing. They're not breaking it down 5, 6, 7, 8. So could you perhaps be doing a disservice by not trying to embody the context in which something would traditionally be taught? Would it perhaps be a good experience for your students to not have you break something down? Okay, so even incorporating the methodologies of non-Western practices can be used in Western practices, and just, sort of stating where these ideas come from and the cultures in which they come from, and incorporating that is also a way to progress and to make steps. And then when you are teaching the context, are you really trying to embody the differences of that style? So there's always, what's that, the old video where it's like the woman and she was like a ballet dancer, but she was teaching hip hop and like the sweatsuit, and you know what I'm talking about? Maybe not. Okay, but anyway, I'll find it and put it in the resources. So you want to think of like really physically embodying whatever the style is supposed to be. Now, obviously, we're not experts in every single thing. And I think another thing we need to think about and be comfortable with is telling our students, hey, I'm not an expert in this, but I do want to expose you to this. So keep in mind, as I'm doing this, I may not be physically reflecting the culture or the context or whatever it is. But I think your students also need to see you struggle and figure things out. Some really good moments happen within those contexts. So again, these are just things to ponder. I don't expect anyone to have answers right away. These are just things that you can reflect on as you begin to think about your classroom and your environment, and whether you're already, which I promise you are doing some of these things, and then how can you make conscious shifts to realize what you're doing and continue what you're doing and build on what you're doing. Okay, so I'm never a fan of the idea of resources, eye roll. So I got some digital swag for you all, aka resources. But so we have some that were curated from NCDEO and the IDEA committee. So there are some resources available there. You will receive a copy of this slide deck, and so you'll be able to actually click on all of the things. And then there are also outside resources that are available, some great books, some great things that you can do. I'm really big into visuals, and so clip art and anything that's in there, it's very important to me. So if you're looking for some diverse clip art for your presentations that you do for your students, I have a couple of great resources for you to start incorporating different contexts and styles. There's also some really good tests that you can take. That was provided by Crystal U. Davis in her 2020 NCDEO conference session. So I highly recommend the test. I realized some things about myself. I was like, oh, okay. But again, awareness, reflection, that's the starting point. Some more digital swag for you. These are just additional things that you can do to reflect on your own process. I'm not going to read these out loud because you'll receive a copy of it in the slide deck. And then there's also a great video linked to it at the bottom. And then my final digital swag for you all, because as we're going into this work, it can be very daunting. And so we do want to make sure, as we are reflecting on this process and hopefully not viewing ourselves in a negative way, but just viewing like, I want to grow. Anyway, while you're doing all of that, take care of yourself, please, educators. So I have some sorry, not sorry self-care for educators of some things that I like to do that work for me. So one is actually a Spotify playlist of a podcast of just tiny small meditations. You can do it. You can do it in the hallway. You can do it at the beginning of your planning period in your office. You can do it while your students are on a break. Like, there are all sorts of great ways that you can sneak in little fun tidbits for yourself to make sure that you're taking care of yourself. If you would like something more financially based, there is the Teacher Care Crate, where you can do a little subscription thing, and then they subscribe, and then they send you something each month, and it's really exciting. So if you would like to engage in something financially related, go for it. And then there's also this really great thing. I actually do this as part of my self-care Sunday ritual, where I take a wellness bath. So if baths are totally your vibe, you can read all about that and, try a wellness bath. It's great. You'll love it. I promise. Take it, leave it, whatever. But there's your digital swag resources, boo. But yeah, enjoy your digital swag. Okay. So lastly, there is an opportunity for questions, as well as somewhere where we can build on some of the things that we're talking about. And so even if you are looking at the recording, feel free to add to the Jamboard that has been created, where you can share ideas, resources, pop-up questions, what have you, and it will just stay active. And I'll check it every now and then and tune in and follow up to whatever is going on. But yeah, I will open the floor for questions. I'll stop sharing my screen. And yeah, thank you. Are there any questions or ponderings or thoughts that you might be having in these final minutes? I know it's a lot of information.
It's a lot of information, but thank you, Ashley. I'm looking through like the tips you're giving, and I feel like any one of those areas we could have like a whole conversation about, like a whole workshop. I'll just plant the bug in your ear for like next semester or next year. I would really love a discussion specifically on culturally responsive classroom management. And with some tangible like action strategies from your classroom or classrooms of other educators, and particularly like, you know how like on the home decor show you get before and afters, like within the parameters of respecting people's privacy, right? Because this is really getting into like issues, but decontextualized, de-identified scenarios where maybe if we have folks who can speak plainly and honestly about their experiences of like, here's a way I handled classroom management in the past with a particular type of thing, and then reflecting on what I've learned about culturally responsive pedagogy, here's a change I made and here's how I handled that aspect of classroom management or that type of issue now. I'm thinking about like myself and some of the things that I've encountered and going, ooh, was that the best way to handle that? I'm taking received wisdom, and even in a college classroom, issues of like attendance and grading and late work policies and all of that. I've radically shifted those over the years in response to student needs and students, even just thinking about issues of fairness and how that relates particularly to socioeconomic issues when so many of our students work for income outside of school. So yeah, I would love a whole session on that if you want to do it, or find if there's any of our members who are watching this, we would, that idea or any idea that someone has for following up with a more in-depth workshop on a particular topic would be so fascinating, and I think really beneficial for many of my teacher education students, because classroom management, I also feel like, is one of the areas where we don't lesson plan for it, but how we react in the moment says so much, communicates so much, and it teaches our students so much of the hidden curriculum. And it's a place where we can really live out our values that we say we have related to culturally responsive pedagogy. So
Yes,
we've got our work cut out for us.
to all of that. I don't know where to begin, but I would love to make it happen. That is a great idea. And that is something that I get asked a lot about is, classroom management and how I take to and handle discipline, which I do have some strategies. So I will offer a very quick tip that I have begun implementing myself before I react to anything that happens in the room. Like literally just take a breath before anything happens. Not like a heavy berated breath, because you don't want the kids to think that you're, upset. But like for real, just like breathe for like a second before reacting to anything that's happening in the classroom. And that has honestly saved me quite a bit. So that's something very teeny tiny and minute that you can literally apply tomorrow. Breathe. So simple, but like really important.
Well, thank you. We're at time. Thank you so much, Ashley, for presenting for us tonight. Thank you, Anna, for joining us live. And thank you to anyone who is accessing our recording and joining us at a later date. I also want to invite you all to our next workshop Wednesday, which will be coming up in a little over a month. That will be happening on, I'm pulling it up, hang on, December 13th. So we'll be in the thick of finals for my higher ed friends, and my K-12 friends will probably be like, break is in sight, but not quite there yet. My colleague E.E. Balkos from UNC Charlotte, who's a registered somatic dance educator, will be leading us through a workshop on relaxation and rejuvenation through body-mind awareness. So EE is really great at doing this also over Zoom. So for those who want to just take an hour out and really embrace Ashley's call to self-care as part of our practice, please join us for that work with EE coming up in about a month. We'll also be having our NCDEO annual in-person conference coming up on February 3rd at UNC Greensboro. Our theme this year is advocacy in action. We're currently reviewing proposals and putting the schedule together, and registration will be up shortly. So we look forward to getting to see everyone in person in a couple months. The workshop materials will be emailed with a link to the video next Monday to everybody who registered. And we look forward to seeing you all again. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.